And I would like to introduce our speakers. Our speakers today are representatives from Atlantic Black Box. We have with us Meadow Dibble. Meadow is the founding director of Atlantic Black Box. Currently, she is a visiting scholar at Brown University Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice. Kate McMahon is a museum specialist at the National Museum of African American History and Culture at the Smithsonian. She leads research efforts at the Center for the Study of Global Slavery. And Seth Goldstein. Seth is a maritime historian at Mecca with research interests in North Atlantic fisheries, global piracy, New England shipwrecks, and lighthouses, and especially the transatlantic slave trade. So although that was a formal introduction, I can also say that I've been working with these three for about maybe 8 months now, and I'm entirely inspired by the work they're doing, and we are so fortunate to have them here with us. So if we were in person, we'd give a clapping warm welcome to our speakers, but a welcome to our speakers, and you guys can give them some kind of reaction if you'd like, whatever that might look like. We're happy to have you here. So I'm going to turn it over to our speakers. And ladies and gentlemen, you're welcome to take out a notebook and jot down whatever might be interesting to you.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me? Thumbs up? All right, awesome. My name is Meadow. Thanks so much, Ms. King, for the wonderful introduction. As Ms. King mentioned, I'm here with my colleagues Kate McMahon and Seth Goldstein, who you will hear from presently. They are both historians, and I am not. I started doing history completely by accident after I fell into an empty grave, metaphorically speaking, and discovered that there was actually a huge gaping hole in the historical record of my hometown on Cape Cod. This realization led to a further discovery, which was equally distressing. My hometown was not, in fact, an outlier, but very much emblematic of a systemic problem that exists throughout New England. We were thrilled when Ms. King and Mr. Waters invited us to be part of this Real World Starts Now series, especially when they explained that at Baxter Academy, students are committed to studying and helping to solve complex real world problems. And that is because we have a big one for you. And we are here to tell you that you do not need to be a historian to do history. So I'm sure you've all heard of citizen scientists who advance scientific knowledge by collecting and reporting data from their immediate environment and feeding it into a collective repository. This form of crowdsourcing allows researchers who cannot possibly be out in the field covering this vast terrain to understand major trends that impact us all. So by asking non-specialists to observe what's happening right where they are at the micro-local level, with respect to, let's say, bird migration or butterflies or the plastics in the ocean, scientists in this way are able to collect vast amounts of data and connect the dots, showing us then the big picture of what's happening to our environment. And it's when people can see the big picture that they understand the critical importance of making change. We at Atlantic Black Box are taking a similar approach, only we're applying it to a different field. Atlantic Black Box is crowdsourcing history. We're asking communities throughout New England to engage in a collective project of historical recovery. And recovery is the key word here. We believe that we cannot collectively recover from the racism that plagues our society and reproduces age-old inequities until we have collectively worked to uncover New England's deeply repressed racial history. So many hands, it turns out, participated in burying evidence of our region's complicity in the business of slavery and in the slave trade, or swept it under the rug. We believe it's going to take that many hands to uncover it and begin the long process of reckoning. So we hope that you will consider picking up a shovel and helping us to dig. First, what's a black box? I started thinking about black boxes a couple of years ago now, when I sensed that our society was in a free fall, on its way, headed for a crash. I guess it shouldn't be surprising that black boxes are not black, they're orange. And this is because the point is to find them. In the event of a tragic plane crash, it's these small devices designed to record critical flight data that allow investigators to reconstruct events that led up to the accident. Built to be nearly indestructible, we might think of the black box as an archive. Recovering the black box is a form of historical recovery, both literally and metaphorically. Knowing what happened helps to bring closure to grieving families, or at least it can help them along their journey of recovery from such a devastating loss. But for many, comfort only comes with knowing that a concerted effort is being made to prevent such a tragedy from happening again. And that is the true purpose of the black box. It is a device that records history in the interest of progressing towards a better future. What you're looking at here is a 19th century black box. It belonged to my hometown's most famous sea captain, a man by the name of Elijah Cobb. This is a man who is greatly celebrated. He left home at the age of 15. He found himself a ship out of Boston headed for Suriname. And from that point on, from the age of 15 until he retired from the sea in 1820, Elijah Cobb sailed around the Atlantic world and made a tremendous amount of money for himself. He built a beautiful mansion, which is now home to the Brewster Historical Society. What do you notice about the box? It's empty, right? And this is actually a really good metaphor for the state of the archive in New England. The historical record, when it comes to our maritime history, is full of gaping holes. Many of the documents just aren't there. And why is the box empty? Well, a lot of these stark gaps in the maritime record are related, scholars believe, to the fact that, well, a lot of records burned in the fire of 1872 in Boston, for example. The Customs House records went up in flames. However, not all losses can be attributed to such accidents. Stephen Chambers notes that deliberate sabotage often conspired with time and fire to swallow the evidence of our region's involvement in the slave economies of the Americas. A man from my hometown on Cape Cod noted actually that often the problem was due to what he called tidy housewives who burned logbooks and letters. But not everything burned, it turns out. If you walk through the cemeteries of Cape Cod or here in Portland or all along the coast of New England, you will actually find quite a bit of evidence of a presence in West Africa and in the West Indies among these seafaring men. This is just from my town. You'll note that the 1795 headstone, that's the one that actually started me on this journey a couple of years ago. But there are many other indications that men from my town traveled to Africa and died there. If this many men died there, how many went there without dying. So I just wanted to tell you briefly about this man, Elijah Cobb, whose box I showed you. So the document chest, or the black box that he would have carried on his vessels as he sailed throughout the Atlantic world, was empty. And literally there it is nearly, there are very few letters left from this man, who was, again, he was highly revered in my town. He was a public officer after he retired from the sea. He basically ran the town. So this is one of those very prominent gentlemen whose archives, one would think, would have been preserved for posterity. None of those things survived. No logbooks, very few letters, nothing about his voyages. The only thing that was left was his memoir. So instead of primary source documents, what we have is this, an account by the sea captain himself about his seafaring career. It's a really interesting read. I read it when I learned, after asking around town. I was asking around to find out if anyone could tell me about Cape Cod sea captains who had traveled to Africa or the West Indies. And I was told that Elijah Cobb had been to Africa, not once, but twice. So I was really excited to know that he had written a memoir. And I read the thing expecting to find an account of those voyages to Africa. Much to my surprise, there was nothing written about those voyages to Africa. They were completely absent from the memoir. And in fact, the newer edition of the memoir presents an even greater problem. So in the 1925 edition, at least what was mentioned was that Cobb, it was mentioned in the foreword by Ralph Payne that Cobb had been to Africa. And there were a couple of letters in the very back, appended to the back, that he wrote back to his wife from the coast of Africa. So at least, even if Cobb didn't write about his voyages, there was an indication that he had been to Africa. Well, when the memoir was republished in 2011, all of those traces were removed. The effect is that anyone reading Cobb's memoir today will have no idea that any voyages to Africa actually occurred. And it's this sort of effacement or disappearing that happens repeatedly in many ways. It turns out, after much research, I was able to reconstruct what it is that Cobb left out of his memoir. And it's a pretty jaw-dropping story about a voyage on a Maine-built ship that departed from Boston in 1818, spent many months along the coast of West Africa, sailed in a typical triangular itinerary to the West Indies, deposited a mysterious cargo in Martinique before sailing back to Boston, where the arrival of the ship caused an outbreak of yellow fever, which devastated the city of Boston and then went on to affect all of the Atlantic world in 1819. It's a big story. And I mention this to say that this story was actually forgotten and covered up. The question that we need to ask is, how could a story so big have been forgotten? How could we have neglected to take any interest in trying to piece it together all this time? And that leads me to my last point before I pass it off to Seth, which is that New England really doesn't know its history. I know this is a big statement, but the story of the 10 brothers and how it was lost to history is emblematic of a much larger troubling trend. New England's towns, from Lubeck to New London, have managed to forget that it was the slave trade and the business of slavery that built our economy, and that it was this heinous traffic that from time to time brought yellow fever and other plagues to our shores. Just as with the story of the 10 brothers, this stuff is buried, but evidence of it is actually hiding in plain sight. The problem is we haven't been looking. And it's a systemic problem that we don't know the most important thing there is to know about our history. Historians like Kate in this growing field of scholarship know enough to say, however, with certainty that we haven't been researching or discussing or teaching the most important thing there is to know about New England, and that is that we were deeply complicit with the slave trade. Let's not leave out the most important part. All right, I'm going to leave it to you, Seth. Take it away. And feel free to use this time of transition to throw anything up into the chat. Questions?
Can you see my screen? Yeah, all right. Good morning, everyone. I'm going to tell you a little bit today specifically about Portland and the Atlantic world slave economy, a little bit more generally about Maine and the Atlantic world slave economy. So before I do that, I just want to briefly give you some dates here. Hold on, technical issues. I'm just trying to minimize the windows here. I'm just having trouble getting the windows of the people in the Zoom meeting off of my slide so I can see everything.
So I'm trying to think, is there a place that you can hit like?
Oh, here we go. I can move it off. There we go. I got it.
Okay, okay.
So key dates regarding African slavery. First enslaved Africans brought to British North America in 1619. So a year before the Pilgrims arrived in Plymouth, there were enslaved Africans in British North America. Massachusetts and Maine end slavery. Oops, sorry. There we go. 1783. The United States bans the importation of enslaved Africans in 1807, but that doesn't mean that enslaved Africans are not still being brought to the United States. They're being brought to the United States in an illicit slave trade that my colleague Kate will share with you in just a few moments. Fugitive Slave Act is enacted in 1850. Now this is very important because what this states in 1850 that Southern slave owners can now pursue their escaped property of enslaved Africans into the North. And so what this means now is that escaped enslaved Africans no longer are safe in the north of the United States. They now have to flee to Canada to be safe. And in fact, what happens is that a lot of free Africans in the North are kidnapped by deputies from the South, even though they had been freed people for many years, and are brought back to the South as slaves. This is the story that takes place in the movie 12 Years a Slave. So it makes the use of the Underground Railroad much more dangerous and much more difficult. And then finally, the Emancipation Proclamation, 1863, which frees all of the enslaved Africans in the territories of the American South that are rebellious to the United States, but does not free the enslaved Africans in the border states that are still loyal to the United States, or in areas where the Union had already captured territory in the South. Now those slaves won't be freed until 1865. So here we see, this is the Atlantic World Slave Economy, and we call it the Atlantic World Slave Economy in acknowledgement that African slavery is really the engine that's driving this whole economy. And so you can see here, this is from 1650, so quite early in the colonial period. And what we see, if we look up at Maine, we see that Maine is shipping red oak staves, lumber, and fish to Barbados. And at this time, early in this colonial period, Barbados is one of the main productions of sugar. That will be followed by the island of Hispaniola, which is modern day Haiti and the Dominican Republic. Following the Haitian Revolution in the early 1700s, the center for sugar production will shift to Cuba, and Cuba will become our primary trade partner. But so red oak staves, now a stave, so you know, is a component of a barrel. So each individual strip in a barrel is a stave. And so what they would do is they would build the barrels here in Maine and then break them down into staves and hoops and heads. So they would take up less space when they'd be shipped to the West Indies. Then the barrels would be assembled in the West Indies and they would be packed with sugar or molasses for their voyage up here. And so if we look at the arrow coming up to New England or up to the colonies, we see molasses, sugar, and rum is the products that are being shipped from the West Indies to Maine. And so sugar production in the West Indies, we have some pictures here. Now, sugar plantations are considered the first industrial production centers. It combines both aspects of agriculture and factory work. And this also goes along with early capitalism. So, you know, the whole point of these colonies is to generate money. And so some of them have stockholders, so nascent capitalism. But if we look at the lower left, we'll see, you see those rollers there, they would have taken the sugar cane and put it through the rollers to extract the sugar cane juice. And if we look in the upper right here, we see a series of different types of involvement with the sugar production. They're turning these big rollers here using oxen to press the sugar cane. And then in the lower left-hand corner of that picture, we can see they're boiling down the sugar juice to extract the sugar and molasses. And in the bottom right-hand corner, we can see agricultural workers cutting down the actual sugar canes themselves. Now, this was very dangerous work. And often people, enslaved Africans, would get gruesome injuries from engaging this type of labor, and sometimes would perish as a result of some of the activities they had to do. Now, here's a painting of a sugarcane harvest and transportation in Cuba, 1873. I believe that slavery is not abolished in Cuba until 1886. Some of us may find surprising that there were enslaved Africans in the Western Hemisphere that late. Cuban molasses was used to make rum, which was a major commodity here in Maine. Large amount of raw sugar being exported to Maine leads to the city's first sugar house being opened in 1845. And here we see that sugar house. The largest building on the Portland waterfront in the 19th century was John Bundy Brown's sugar refinery. Portland imported 3 times as much molasses as Boston, and the Portland Sugar Works was processing 200 hogshead, a hogshead being a size of cask, and a barrel, in fact, is just a size of casks. So when people talk about barrels, what they really mean is casks. You have all these different sizes of casks, of which a barrel is one of them. And also a hogshead is another size of cask. It's a 63-gallon cask of molasses a day. By 1885, the business employed between 150 and 200 workers, and 10 years later, it employs almost 1,000 individuals. about this time, around 1860, 20% of all the molasses in the US was processed in Portland, more than any other city in the United States. And so, as I said, this is the largest building on the Portland waterfront, 7 stories tall, employing 1,000 people eventually. It burns down as much of the city does during the Great Fire of 1866. Now, this is the gentleman who owned that building. This is John Bundy Brown. He began his career in Portland as a wholesale grocer. His career later branches out into the sugar and molasses business with the Portland Sugar Company, which is a very successful venture in which he involves his oldest son, Philip Henry Brown. As I said, the sugar company refinery burns in the Great Fire of 1866. His other ventures include railroads and hotels, and after his death, he leaves behind a wealthy estate to his sons, Philip Henry Brown and John Marshall Brown, who are the executors of his estate. Brown's contribution to the architectural history of Portland include his home on the Western Promenade, Bramhall, and also the J.B. Brown block in the city of Portland. And his family today is still involved in Portland in commercial real estate. And here, this is his palatial mansion, which he built in 1858 on the Western Bramhall. And so this building has burned down, but what he did was he sold off parcels of land on the Western Prom to his friends who were other rich West Indies merchants. And so when we go to the Western Prom in Portland and we look at these beautiful Victorian buildings that Portland is known for, these buildings were built off of profits that were generated in this Atlantic world slave economy, as were many of the big buildings in town, or many of the Victorian mansions that we're so proud of today, of Portland's architectural heritage, but many of us don't realize that the funds to build these beautiful homes were generated in this trade. So on the left, you see a bottle of Screech rum, which when I first moved up to the Portland area about a dozen years ago, I found, and I was surprised to find a rum that was distilled in Newfoundland, because we often think of rum as being a product of the Caribbean. But you can see here in 1787, 73 of the 89 ships that departed from Portland Harbor were bound for the West Indies, indicating the importance of the trade with the West Indies in the aftermath of the American Revolution. Following the repeal of the 1824 molasses tax, it became cheaper to produce rum in Portland than it was to import it from the West Indies. And hence, Portland had 7 rum distilleries along its waterfront in the early 19th century. 7 rum distilleries. As I said, there's a bottle of Screech to the left. For much of the 19th century, this is a quote from a wonderful essay in a book called Creating Portland, and the name of the essay is Comunidad Escondia. It's about the Latin American involvement in Portland. For much of the 19th century, Portland was a major entrepot of international commerce. Now, entrepot is a word that historians use to describe a place where goods are shipped and stored and then transshipped to another location. So that's all that word means. Fancy word for a place where things are shipped to and stored. And so, of course, Portland was a port, but also had a railroad, and a lot of the buildings that are now on the Portland waterfront were warehouses where goods would be stored. At a time when Cuba was the United States' 3rd largest trading partner, Portland was one of the major ports in this exchange, and Maine ships were among the most common vessels trafficking in the West Indies. Ships loaded with lumber, bricks, and ice set sail for the Caribbean islands and returned with sugar, molasses, rum, and goods to stock local grocery stores. And local grocery stores would have a sign in the window that would say WI Goods, which would stand for West Indies Goods. And that were produce like bananas and pineapples that would come up from the Caribbean along with all of this sugar, molasses, and rum. The wealth generated in this trade affected Portland's physical environment, from landfill extended wharfs to large homes that remain central to Portland's identity. The Portland bricks that dot the streets of Trinidad, Cuba are symbolic of the intricate relation between Portland and Latin America. So one of the important commodities that we send to the West Indies is salt cod. Cod, perhaps one of the most important fish species in human history, so important that it got a book, The Biography of the Fish That Changed the World, by a gentleman named Mark Kurlansky, a book just about the significant role of the codfish in world history. And the reason why is that its flaky white flesh lent itself to being preserved by salting, which is a critically important factor before refrigeration. And so we have to think about before refrigeration. Now, refrigeration is only about 120 years old. Before refrigeration, all of your food would have had to have been preserved in some fashion. Whether it was by salting it or smoking it or pickling it, it would have to be preserved. And so because the texture of the cod flesh takes the salting process so well, it's the cheapest protein available before refrigeration, and hence large quantities are shipped from Portland, Maine, which is the fish export center of Maine, to the West Indies to feed the population of enslaved Africans working in the plantations. Cod can grow to impressive size. A fish 6 feet in length and weighing over 211 pounds was caught off the coast of Massachusetts in 1895. So that's not even that long ago. 1895 is, historically 135 years ago. So we're not talking about fish that they were catching in the 1600s. So how big of a fish is that, right? I'm a 6 foot tall guy. I'm like a little bit larger than your average dude. And I weigh, about 211 pounds. So we're talking about codfish the size of this guy, right? Which is pretty incredible to think about. And even not that long ago, historically, and they were catching fish between 50 and 60 pounds, historically not uncommon. They don't catch codfish that big any longer because the fish have been overfished, unfortunately. But the fish is so important to the post-revolutionary New England economy that a wooden codfish hung from the ceiling of the old State House in Boston. And guess what? That wooden codfish still hangs from the ceiling of the State House in Boston today. So here's a really awesome picture. This is the Portland fishing fleet in 1882. And if you go today down to the Portland waterfront, and this is behind Harbor Fish, right? So you go down there today, it looks very much the same. The fishing boats still come into this dock. They still unload their catches. Big difference is that they're motorized fishing boats, and the fish go right into the Harbor Fish Market where they're processed by their fish workers or their fish cutters, right? Now this is a flake yard. So this is Portland, once again, 1882. And so each one of those pieces of white that you see there is an individual fillet of cod that's been salted and laid out into the sun to cure into salt cod. And so it gives you an idea of the scale of this industry. I mean, as far as you can see, this flake yard. So much fish being processed here in Portland for export. And once again, this is just another picture from the same series of the flake yards. This is where they would dry the cod here in Portland. Another major commodity that went from Maine to the West Indies was lumber. And this is due to the fact that much of Cuba's forests have been burned down to make room for sugar plantations. So that's what they call a monoculture. So they've cut down everything else. In fact, they're not even growing their own food crops because the sugar is so profitable. They're just growing sugar. And so the lumber comes from Maine and New England, as does a lot of the food that they eat in Cuba. So their supplies much of the lumber for the city of Matanz in Cuba, and as much of that city is built with Maine and New England lumber. Maine also supplies many of the boxes and casks that the sugar and molasses were shipped in. And as I said, they would take the barrels and they would be broken down into their components and shipped to the West Indies where they would be assembled. And people who build barrels are called coopers. And sometimes coopers from Maine would go down to Cuba in the winter to assemble these barrels. That was their off season, and they would do that as extra work. And finally, the shipbuilding industry. As we all know, Maine is known for its shipbuilding industry, and it's one of the big components, and also for its sailors and captains. And it's not, it's no mistake that on the seal of the state of Maine, you have two men. You have a farmer on the one side. On the other side, you have a sailor, right? These are the two big industries that Maine is known for, along with the lumber industry. And so Maine, one of the big shipbuilding centers of the United States in the 1800s, an unknown number of Maine ships were built specifically for the slave trade, and other ships were converted to that purpose. And so with that, I'll hand it off to my colleague, Kate McMahon, who will tell you more about the illicit slave trade.
Thanks, Seth. All right. So it's really nice to be with you all today, even if it's digitally. I am going to build off of what Meadow and Seth have been talking about. And so the first thing I'm going to do is just run this video here, and hopefully it works. Let's see, there it goes. And I want you to watch as I'm talking about what happens after about 1620. Watch the number of dots. And this is slave ship journeys in the world, in the Atlantic world, through 1865. And so what you're going to notice is after the 17th century, the number of ships increased greatly, and particularly after 1700, you begin to see a huge amount of traffic to the Caribbean and to South America, and a smaller amount of traffic coming to mainland North America. And this is because, building off of what Seth was talking about, the world had a great desire for sugar and other commodities produced by enslaved people. And that included cotton, it included dyes like indigo, but there were even enslaved people who worked as carpenters or seamstresses or any manner of jobs. And so, but the majority of enslaved people that were taken out of Africa were taken to one of these sugar producing colonies. And so you see here, the majority of people are going to Cuba and the West Indies, or to South America, primarily to Brazil. And you'll notice at 1776, the traffic dips because during the American Revolution, there was an embargo on trade for a lot of different countries. But after the American Revolution, it picks right back up again.
Kate, I'm just going to interrupt you for one moment. Is there a way that you can maximize this video screen so that we can see it better? It's hard on our end to see the dots. I don't know if you're able to present just that slide, like in a present mode, or
I can pull up the video. Hold on one second. Sorry, everyone. Let's see. Here we go. Can you see this?
Yeah, that's going to be better, I believe. Yeah, now we can see the dots as they move.
Okay.
Oh yeah, that's excellent.
Fast forwarded a little bit to 17.
Yeah.
So you'll see here, what begins to happen is, a lot of these ships, each dot represents an individual ship. The larger the dot, the larger number of enslaved people that were aboard that vessel. So you see where people are being brought out of in Africa, primarily West Africa, but also down here in Southwestern Africa. Angola was a large exporter of enslaved people. And this has a lot to do with the different countries that were colonizing these different areas. So, for example, Portugal was the colonizer of Brazil, Angola, Sao Tome and Principe, which are small islands off of the coast of West Africa that Meadow was talking about earlier. And these colonizing countries brought these enslaved people to Africa, to these colonies, in order to produce sugar primarily. But you can see there's also, here's the 1776, traffic stops to the United States. And then here it picks back up again, and you see where it's flowing to, primarily to Charleston. Charleston was the largest single port that brought enslaved people into the United States, but Newport, Rhode Island also played a large role during the legal period. And here we're going to hit 1808, and this is when the legal traffic is supposed to stop. And here you see the huge numbers of journeys now flowing almost exclusively to Brazil and Cuba. And this is what I'm going to talk about this morning is the illegal period of the slave trade. Now see how much larger the dots get now? This is because during this illegal period, they were doing everything they could to maximize profits and maximize the number of enslaved people that were aboard each vessel. I'm gonna switch over again. Okay, so can you all see my slides again? Yes, got it. Whoa, I got an ad playing for the old one. Let's see. Over here, what we see is these are the total numbers of enslaved people transported during all of the slave trade that we know about. And that's over 12.5 million people were brought out of Africa, but 1.7 million people arrived. And so that difference of 1.8 million people, that's the number of people that died during the journey alone. And so if you think about millions and millions of people that were killed as a result of being just transported, just being put on a slave ship, and that has nothing, you know, we don't know the numbers of people that died upon arrival. We don't have an accurate estimate for this. And so what do we mean by global? What does it mean to say that this trade was a global trade? This means that it touched every continent on Earth. Our world was completely shaped by slavery and the world that slavery built. And Maine is not separate from this. But what we understand some of these numbers, but we really don't understand the full scope of slavery and how it affected our world. And that is because slavery studies are a relatively new thing. They've been around really since the early mid-20th century, but the field has taken on a new form in the last 20 or so years. And so in New England, we really don't understand what our role in this bigger picture is, because what we do know...
Kate, I'm sorry to interrupt you again. This is fascinating. May I suggest that you hit use slideshow, because it's hard for us to see. We have all of your notes. If you hit use slideshow, would that work for you?
What is it showing you? Oh, I didn't realize it was showing the presenter to view. Sorry.
Yeah, that's okay. That's okay.
Let's see. Is that better?
Much. Perfect.
Okay.
Yeah.
So slavery touched every continent in the world in some way. And sorry, I lost myself here. And Maine is no different from this. So there was an immense human toll on what this means for people. And so what we need to do in New England is really think about what our role in this. And so like Seth said, the legal slave trade was abolished by the British in 1807 and by Americans in 1808. But some ships still entered the United States illegally and brought enslaved people to the United States illegally. And we really don't understand the full scope of this, because like if you make anything illegal, people hid the evidence of what they were doing. They hid their crimes. And so we really don't understand the full scope of this. And this also has to do with racism built within the way that we study history, the way that we understand history. And until relatively recently, people in New England have repeated the same story, that we have a very heroic maritime history, one that that should celebrate our maritime heritage and not think about all of the complex ways in which our maritime history really was the cause of a lot of suffering for a lot of other people. So even if we think about just what Seth was talking about those slave economies, that, you know, those enslaved, there were millions of enslaved people making the sugar and dying. The average life expectancy for a person on a sugar plantation when they arrived in the New World was only 7 years. So and the average age of a person being brought to the New World slavery was 15. So you can relate to that yourselves as being of that same age group, that you would have been taken from your family, you would have been put into this situation, forced across a harrowing middle passage where many people, if they survived it, were sick upon arrival. And then you get put into conditions where it's over 100 degrees and you're cooking around over cauldrons every single day. So, you know, the life expectancy for someone was very short. And what does it mean for New England that we've been involved in this, quote, West Indies trade since our colonial period? And what does that actually mean for the way that our state has been built and how we remember it? And, you know, maritime trades, as Seth was saying, were and still are deeply important to the state of Maine. Maine had the second highest percentage of registered seamen in the United States in 1843. When you think about our population, we're only really second to Massachusetts, which had a significant number of registered sailors that lived in that state. But it means that Mainers, during the same time period where we saw these large groups of slave vessels going to Brazil and Cuba, Mainers are involved in this. And so I'm going to talk about briefly two stories of two different stories of this slave trade. And the first is of a man named Ebenezer Farwell, who was from Vassalboro. In 1838, he was charged with importing slaves to the United States. So you see here on the left-hand side, a newspaper article. He essentially was charged with having brought a group of enslaved people to the United States after having been on what was supposed to have been a legitimate trading journey to Liberia in modern-day West Africa. And he was, when the transit arrived in port, the local African-American community discovered that 3 enslaved Africans were hidden aboard the vessel. And they actually rescued these people and went down and helped get Farwell and other members of the crew arrested. So Farwell ends up going back to Maine, and it is discovered that he had left an additional person to work on his father's farm in Vassalboro, which you see in the top right image. That's his father's farm. And so what does that mean? That means a person who did not choose to come to the United States was forced to come to the United States and forced to work in Maine during a period which was supposed to be over 60 years after slavery had been abolished in the state of Maine. So what does that mean for the state of Maine, right? So Farwell makes a lot of money on this journey. He's eventually found innocent. Essentially, the United States government finds, and this is pretty common during this time period, they did not want to prosecute people. And this has a lot to do with our presidents during this time period. We had a number of slaveholding presidents. Of course, a lot of you probably are familiar with Andrew Jackson and the Trail of Tears, but we had other slaveholding presidents like John Tyler, who were very sympathetic to slaveholders and to slave trading and did not want to prosecute people. And so Farwell was found innocent of importing slaves. They basically said that These people were indentured servants. An indentured servant basically means that you are a servant of this person for a period of time. Usually it's a period of like 7 years, 8 years, something like that. And after that, your labor, you're free to do with what you want with your labor. However, if we think about what this person who was brought to Vassalboro experienced, his movement was forced, his labor was forced, and therefore he didn't choose to go. And so Farwell, the following, makes all this money and decides to build this humongous house. You see this big house up in the left-hand corner here. This is his house. It's in Vassalboro. It sticks out like a sore thumb. It's right next to his father's house. So very different looking buildings. And he builds this very grand house between 1839 and 1841. But he runs out of money and isn't able to actually finish building the inside out, and decides to go on another journey to West Africa. And he returns to the same part of Liberia that he was in before. And you see, I've circled it on this map. And this is the modern day boundary between Liberia and the Ivory Coast, the country of Cote d'Ivoire. And so this is where he was heading to this area here, and he was interacting with people of the Yoruba ethnicity. So he becomes he becomes the captain of a vessel called the Mary Carver in 1841 and sails there, and something happens, and there's differing accounts as to what happens. And this is what my role as a historian is, to try to read these different accounts and interpret what the actual history was. And so what follows is that according to the official United States government accounts, there was an unprovoked attack on Farwell and his crew, and the crew was murdered and the ship was sunk in Liberia. But when I went back and I started to read these records, so records like this is from the Maine Historical Society, I started to understand that, in fact, Farwell was there as a slave trader. And the reason why he was killed was because he killed 2 local people and was murdered as a result, basically as a punishment for his crime. But that didn't stop the United States government from the year following, in 1842, taking a Maine-built ship called the sloop of war Saratoga. It was a large vessel you see here. It had a lot, you can't really see in this image, but it has a lot of cannons. So lots of guns all lining this rail here. Well armed, and you can even see you can see there's a cannon in this middle image. This is an image of the crew, this same crew, and the sailors in the background. And they return to West Africa and actually proceed to go on a voyage of revenge. And they burn 11 towns and kill an unknown number of Africans as a result of this. No one has ever talked about this before. This is a new story. So you guys are like some of the first folks even hearing about this history. And what does that mean? What does that mean for our United States government, the history of our military? What does that mean for the history of West Africa? And there are other stories like this. And this is another story. In 1844, a Maine-built vessel called the Porpoise traveled to East Africa, to Mozambique, which is across the Indian Ocean, the Mozambique Channel from Madagascar. So if you see Madagascar, it's the land that's directly across from that. Mozambique was one of the major sites of pillaging for enslaved people during the illegal period, particularly by the Portuguese, to bring enslaved people to Brazil. So in 1845, Pedro is taken as a slave aboard a Maine-built vessel called the Porpoise that was traveling with a number of other Maine vessels off of Mozambique. And you see here, this is where he essentially was taken from what I think is this part of Mozambique. This is called Cabo Delgado, and brought to an island off of the coast of Maputo, which is the modern day capital of Mozambique, called Inyaka. And there he and his older brother rather, were sold as enslaved people to a Portuguese slave trader named Manuel Pinto da Fonseca. And so those vessels, and there were 5 vessels all traveling together, all Americans and all from New England. They returned to Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. And when they pull in, they are captured by the United States Navy. They're stopped by a vessel called the Raritan, and on board there was the American consul, who was the American representative in Brazil, George William Gordon, who arrested the crew and seized the enslaved people that were left. And there were only 3 enslaved people left aboard the Porpoise, and that was Pedro, who you see here, another boy named Guilherme, and Pedro's brother named Luis. And Pedro and Guilherme were actually taken to Maine and brought here to work as, were adopted by the, Pedro was adopted by the United States Marshal for the state of Maine, whose name was Virgil Paris. So if you know Paris, Maine, the town of the Paris family, and Pedro actually moved to Paris, Maine, and became a member of this family. And he testified at the trial of the captain, and just like what had happened with Farwell a few years earlier, eventually Captain Libby is found innocent. But Pedro continues to live in Maine, and he actually becomes an abolitionist. He works with George William Gordon and goes on a whistle-stop tour of New England with him when Gordon. And Pedro actually painted his experience in the slave trade. And so this is a painting that Pedro did probably around between 1845 and 1850. And on the left here, this image is Rio de Janeiro. So there's a very famous landmark that in the port of Rio de Janeiro, that is this. And in the back, you see all of these buildings, and these are soldiers. And there's even a little dog here. And this image in the center is the porpoise. And so you see this the American flag proudly represented. This is a very large painting in real life. It's like 6 or 8 feet long. And over here, if anyone recognizes what this is in the city of Portland, if you do, put it in the chat. Anyone? It's the Portland Observatory. So who has been, if anybody's been to the Portland Observatory before, the Portland Observatory is one of the oldest standing buildings in the city of Portland. It did not burn down in our fires. So this is the observatory up on the hill. In the far right hand corner is the family farm in Paris Hill. And so you see there's family members depicted here as well. And so Pedro goes on, unfortunately he dies in 1860 of pneumonia, never had a family, never got married, but we know a lot more about his story than we know about most people's stories. So what does this all mean? Well, what is your role? What could your role be? We are trying at Atlantic Black Box to understand the full scope of New England's role in slavery and the slave economies. And so one thing we've been doing is we are trying to collect data. And one thing I have been working on is this list over here. This is slave ships that I've been able to identify between 1854 and about 1865 in the state that were from the state of Maine. And so you see here, this is just ships that went to Cuba during a relatively short time period. Maine vessels moved approximately 18,000 people that I know of. Left Africa, about 17,000 people died. So Maine vessels were responsible for at least 1,000 deaths. But if you look on the right, I've only got numbers for maybe half of these. So really what we're hoping to do at Atlantic Black Box is to really dig more deeply and understand, how does this all tie in together? How does the merchant economies that Seth was talking about, how did those relate to slavery in these other places? And what is our role in New England's role in the moving of these people? And further from that, what does that actually mean for the outcomes for people of African descent and other people of color in Maine? How did our involvement in all of this, in all of these economies, make Maine one of the whitest states in the country? How did it make Maine, why do we still have these incidents of race and bias in the state of Maine? Well, if we look at this, these guys that owned these ships, these guys were our town aldermen. They were our Elijah Cobbs. They were our most respected citizens. And so these were the people that were setting up the laws, making the rules. What does that mean for our, the way that people are able to live now? And so I think that's pretty much my, the end of my component. Meadow, do you want to hop back on?
Thanks, Kate. I was going to show a couple more slides and like underscoring exactly the points Kate was just making at the end there about how this history connects to our present. But I think more importantly, we want to give you a chance to respond to what you've seen and ask questions, and we can, we can get to some of that. But let's get to your questions first. So Mary and Tyler, are you getting questions in the chat?
Haven't yet, but if folks want to send any in, I am looking at the chat and I can read it out loud for you.
Okay. I'm sure you will get some momentarily.
All right, we got one in here from Anthony. When was the Atlantic Black Box founded?
Thanks, Anthony. Atlantic Black Box was actually its second iteration. It was actually born as Cape Cod Black Box because back in 2017, when the idea was born, I was living still, well, again, in my hometown of Brewster on Cape Cod. But there was always the idea that, okay, when we began to realize that this was a systemic problem throughout New England, the idea was to create a box that could be an open source proposition that other communities throughout New England could replicate. So there might be a Cape Cod Black Box, and there might be a Cumberland County, Maine Black Box, or there might be a Newport, Rhode Island Black Box. What we've since done is really just we've created a platform, Atlantic Black Box, that embraces all of these different areas in the region. And we are, it's our website, which you can find at www.atlanticblackbox.com, really is looking to serve as a hub and a clearinghouse of information for all those who are interested in this research and New England's connections to the slave trade and the economy of enslavement. So if you go there, you'll find that we have, it's a multi-author blog space, among other things. And we've got people from around New England contributing stories. Some of them are descendants of the enslaved, some are descendants of enslavers, some are teachers who are looking to integrate the history of Black and Indigenous communities of New England into their curriculum. Some are scholars like Kate. So I'll leave it there.
Excellent. And then sort of on a similar note, how does the average person go about collecting data for the Atlantic Black Box?
So Kate, you can pick this up after as well if you want, but a couple of things that we're doing. We're essentially organizing collective research projects. So we've got one going right now that we've just launched called the 1820 Ship News Project. This involves, because here we are in Maine celebrating the bicentennial of our state, 200 years since Maine gained its independence from Massachusetts. Massachusetts acceded to statehood. And there's a lot of discussion in the community. What should we be commemorating at this moment? What should we be celebrating? We thought this would be a really good time to look back at Portland's specifically, again, because we're really interested in micro local history. So looking at Portland's maritime trade in the year 1820. And one way to do that is through the shipping news column of the Eastern Argus newspaper, which later became the Portland Press Herald. So we have collected that column for every time it appeared during the year 1820. And anyone who's interested in participating in this project receives a column to process. And so we have a tutorial for how to go about processing the data. It's really simple. Each column, doesn't take more than an hour, for example. But if we get a lot of people on board, helping with this in a very short amount of time, by entering information about what ships were arriving in Portland, where were they departing to, what were they carrying, and who was at the helm and who were the owners, we will have a very clear snapshot of Portland's maritime trade in this critical, pivotal year of 1820. And in contributing the data will contribute significantly to our understanding of Maine's history, at this important moment. Because once we've got the big picture, then we can really just start talking about it and making sense of it. We expect that based on preliminary, work, that what we will find is a heavy traffic to the West Indies, as Seth explained in detail. That the trade in sugar and molasses, in particular, was a large part of what these guys were up to. But data matters, right? We know this. So specifically, what can we say? And you can help us figure that out.
Awesome. And then another question here was about basically that video of all the folks being transported there. Is there a reason for why there were so many ships going between Africa and South America specifically?
Yeah, so the two largest sugar producing colonies were Brazil and Cuba. So those two countries, if we think about sugar production, it exploded, exponentially every year. The amount of sugar that the world was consuming and the world wanted went up tenfold. And so each year from, beginning in the 17th century, it started to creep up. And by the 18th century, the world had a huge desire for sugar. And with that came a lot of plantations being built, more of the Amazon being cleared for plantations in Brazil. And so sugar becomes this massive commodity. And a little later, around 1800 rather, coffee also becomes a major imported into the United States. Everybody loves coffee. Well, coffee was also a huge commodity produced by enslaved people, as well as chocolate. So we have coffee, chocolate, and sugar. We have this big desire that grows really in the 19th century. Nobody could afford to eat any of that prior really to the introduction of the plantation system, to this large-scale industrial agriculture that comes out of the late 18th century, in particular around 1750s, when plantations really start to get bigger, more elaborate, more uniform, and sugar becomes this major exporter. And so the only sugar really produced in the entire world was produced by enslaved people. And so even after 1866, which is when Brazil abolishes slavery in their colony, you see that traffic continuing to Cuba, because sugar is still being produced by enslaved people, like Seth said, well into the 1880s. And after that, we also have at the same time period the introduction of indentured labor. So as slavery starts to become abolished, there's a rise in this form of indentured labor, primarily of people of Asian descent. So you start to see Chinese people being brought into these same plantations to work as indentured laborers, beginning really in the 1860s is when this starts to take off, who are working and toiling and dying in conditions that are very similar to slavery. And there's a whole other, geopolitical reason for China in particular, as we don't have time to get into today. But, it really has everything to do with sugar. That's why South America is the major. Of all of the 12 million people that left Africa, 7 million of them went to Brazil, versus all the other countries. It shakes down from there. So really, if we look at the number of enslaved people that were brought to the United States, for example, it's only about 350,000. And the United States, the reason why there were so many enslaved people here in the United States is that our mortality rate wasn't as high. And so we had a self-reproducing population, meaning people were born, and there were more people born than died. Essentially. And so that's why by 1860, when slavery, during the slave census in the United States, there are about 4 million enslaved people here that live here, but they were mostly born here.
Got it. And we do have a few other questions, but we are running low on time, so I'm going to change it over to Ms. Kane.
Okay. Thank you. It's all so fascinating, and I know that we could ask questions for hours. We will continue this conversation in our classes and through our advisory. We'll follow up. So Seth, Kate, and Meadow, we are so grateful for the time you spent with us, and the information that you shared is in some ways devastating, but at the same time so important.